to focus on LGBT issues. You know, the starting place is, what do we want? We want the candidates, we want the next president to believe that our community deserves the same equality, respect, and dignity as every person in this country is entitled to. When people shared that simple but profound belief, all things would follow. Now, to be a little more specific, though, about what some of those things to follow should be and what we need, as Executive Director of a legal organization, I need to start with the Supreme Court. There is probably little that's more important than who is nominated to the Supreme Court, because there will surely be vacancies over the next 4 years. Vacancies among justices who believe that core constitutional rights, such as equal protection, apply equally to the LGBT community, and we need to have those justices replaced by justices that share that vision and value. And although the Supreme Court is certainly the highest impact, indeed, all federal judicial appointments are incredibly critical. And so that's where I need to start. There is also no shortage of legislative issues that we would like to see addressed. And I'm going to talk about a few of them. A couple of them are repeals of hateful and mean-spirited pieces of legislation, and a couple of them are more affirmative things that would be helpful. Certainly in the news, we've heard a lot of discussion, and there was recently a congressional hearing about don't ask, don't tell, that which keeps gay and lesbian people from serving in the armed forces. Now, Clintons don't ask, Bill Clinton's don't ask, don't tell, has been repudiated by many military leaders, by many frontline soldiers and military personnel, and by the majority of the American public. And yet it continues as law, which harms both LGBT people who aren't allowed to serve who want to, as well as our country. So we would certainly like to see the repeal of don't ask, don't tell, and of course that sits on both the president, senators, congresspeople. All of these elections, all of these races are so critically important. The other piece of mean-spirited legislation that came from the Bill Clinton administration is the Defense of Marriage Act. The Defense of Marriage Act has two parts to it, one of which says that no state should be required to recognize the marriage of a same-sex couple from another state, a piece that was totally gratuitous and unnecessary because there is no such requirement. And the other piece is the piece that denies to legally married same-sex couples the over 1,000 federal rights and benefits that accrue to marriage. And certainly at GLAAD, we have talked to hundreds of married couples who are harmed every day by their inability to access federal benefits. And it's such a key economic issue, particularly for those people in our community who are living on the edge, who depend on Social Security, and whose inability to take advantage of some of the spousal benefits hurts them every single day. Because of the Defense of Marriage Act, in Congress is currently a law to try and remedy at least one of the harms, and that's the Family Fairness Act, which deals with immigration. Same-sex couples are ripped apart by the inability of one spouse to bring his or her spouse or partner into this country. The Family Fairness Act looks to treat same-sex couple relationships similar to opposite-sex couple relationships, another important piece of legislation for our community. And finally, I want to talk about ENDA, the Employment Non-Discrimination Act, which was certainly in the news a great deal this year. The House passed a version of ENDA. A lot of the focus, if you were following it, was the stripping of protections based on gender identity and expression from the version of ENDA that was passed by the House, and it caused tremendous turmoil in the community. But don't think that that's the only problem with the ENDA that's currently making its way through Congress. Although it's important to have some protections against discrimination in employment, this version has gaping loopholes. The religious exemption, you can't even call it a loophole. The religious exemption allows any religious institution and affiliated institution, so we're not just talking churches, we're talking hospitals, social service agencies, universities, to discriminate in employment solely and simply on the basis of sexual orientation. So it's an imperfect bill at best, and yet still important to get federal protections for those people who live in the majority of U.S. states where there is no protection against discrimination in employment based on sexual orientation. But I think, as Cynthia talked about with the gag order, legislation is not the only place where a president can make a difference. There are untold numbers of regulations embedded in executive offices that have a huge impact on our life. And what's particularly been so horrifying to me over the last number of years is how deeply conservative ideology has penetrated these executive agencies and made decisions that hurt all of us in so many ways. And, you know, just a couple of very small examples of places where you can make a difference. Federal funding and grant programs. Do we have youth programs that address the special issues of LGBT youth? Do we have HIV prevention programs that really talk about gay men of color, women of color? Where is the federal money going? We know that a lot of it's going to faith-based initiatives, but where else is that money going? There's also things as basic as, you know, elderly or disabled couples living in federal housing programs. Do same-sex couples get access to shared bedroom facilities, you know, shared apartment facilities? Many, many things that can happen by regulation. And in fact, there's a task force of people from around the country who's writing a briefing book for the next administration on things that could happen purely by regulation. I just want to mention the other thing that certainly I want, and I just can't help but mention better media coverage. I am so tired of screaming at the radio when commentator after commentator just accepts the right-wing formulation of any particular issue and parrots it back as if it's truth. The one issue that drove me crazy recently was a series of articles and radio stories on the conflict between religious liberty and LGBT rights. And if gay people have their rights, then people will not have freedom of religion, and this most horrible thing's going to happen, which is clergy will be required to marry same-sex couples. And it was portrayed as if this is the conflict, with no conversation about our country's long history of dealing with when and how people have freedom of religion and what happens in the public sphere, and your requirements when you choose to act in the public sphere. Over the last 20 years, we have seen dramatic improvements in public opinion polls related to all sorts of LGBT issues, whether it's adoption, service in the military, non-discrimination, protections for relationships. And this election is such a critical turning point where that progress can be accelerated or stopped. And I know what I'm hoping for. Thank you.